You're listening to Superflexology, a Superflex-focused fantasy football podcast with your hosts John Bauer and Mitch Sorensen.
Welcome to episode 21 of Superflexology, a proud member of the Full-Time Fantasy Network. I'm your host, John Bauer. You can find me on Twitter at The Bauer Club. And of course, joined by Mitch Sorensen, and that's at DinoMC on Twitter. What's going on, Mitch?
Hey, what's up, man? How you been?
Oh, as always, living the dream. So we do have a few things that we want to talk about before we get into tonight's another fantastic show. Mitch, why don't you talk about the start-sit show and then your baby here, kind of the daily stuff?
So we've been talking about this for a few weeks, trying to figure out what we want to do during the season. And we're still going to have the normal Superflexology podcast where we'll dive into the current happenings around Dynasty and player values. And under the same feed, we'll also have a sit-start episode that we're going to have a couple buddies come on. We're going to have Jordan DFF. He's at Jailbreak Screen. He was on a few weeks ago with us. Had a really good time with him. And then we also have Dan, hopefully I'm saying his last name right, La Magna. It's at LC Dean, and he is also a writer for FF Statistics, and he's a really good friend of ours, so he's going to come on and help out with that. We're going to have some good games going on at that time.
I like how you say really good friend, but we're not quite sure how to say his last name. And we're in leagues with all these people, and we talk to people every single day. And that's kind of what's awesome about fantasy football. And it's like, what's his last name? How do you pronounce it? Not sure, but we talk every single day.
Exactly. And then we're going to try to do a weekly DraftKings contest as well to have the listeners join in, and just not a lot of money, just something to do for fun. But that's something that we're looking forward to during the season.
The start-sit show, it's going to be fantastic during the season. In addition to our typical weekly Superflexology show, then like Mitch said, the DraftKings contest, that's going to be just something fun, something interactive with all the listeners. But let's get into tonight's episode. And tonight we're joined by a fellow network mate, and he's the host of the Fantasy Football Consistency Show. But more importantly, and I think this is pretty awesome, the creator of the Consistency Guide. And it actually won the 2018 FSWA Best Fantasy Football Publication, the King of Consistency. So there's some nice alliteration there. Bob Lung, what's going on, Bob?
Not too much, guys. Thanks for having me on. Always honored to be on anybody's show. The fact that I even get asked to be on a show, I think, is pretty cool. But yeah, it was an amazing feeling last year to kind of get the phone call, or whatever you want to call it. I was nominated for the second year in a row for Best Magazine, and I get the call from Sirius. They're like, "You're going on in 5 minutes. You won." And I literally, you can ask my wife, I literally was screaming through the house going, "I won! I really won!" So yeah, that was pretty cool. And it's just been a passion for years for me. So yeah, thank you for having me on again. It's been great.
Absolutely. And when you won, did you have a speech prepared? Did you have a bunch of thank yous for everybody?
Actually, they brought me on, and the funny thing is, this is sad too. I should know this guy named Paul Charchian. Is that how you pronounce his name? The guy from Fanball.
Yep.
So he's a big deal in the industry, but he from the standpoint of what he's done, I think he's actually an FSWA Hall of Famer. But obviously, Paul didn't know much about me nor the book. And so you could tell he was struggling to try to figure out how to ask me questions about it, because I don't think he'd ever seen it. So that was, it was kind of like, "Oh, Bob, congratulations. So this book is about consistency, I'm sure, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it is." It was just, I wish I could go back and find the on-demand, because it's a very awkward interview. I was so excited I couldn't see straight. And then he asked me this question. I'm like, "Did he really just ask me if that was a book about?" I'm like, "What is this guy, Lisa Ann? Come on, let's go."
It was very generous of you. You gave them out to the participants of the Scott Fishbowl 9. And as soon as I saw that you were the mastermind behind this publication, I told Mitch, I was like, "We got to get this guy on the show." And, it turned out then that you're also on the Full-Time Fantasy Network. It couldn't have been any better. But before we get into the consistency talk, I got to ask you a question. So on Twitter, I saw some fantastic pictures from the Hall of Fame weekend. Mm-hmm. You were with Champ Bailey. Yep. Tell us about that. How did that come to fruition?
So the first thing you got to do, it's always helpful, is to live in Canton, Ohio, and live 2 miles away from the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That's a good start. The second way is that 30 years ago, this is my 30th year driving, one of my best friends from high school had gotten on the committee the year before, and it's called the Transportation Committee. You volunteer for the weekend, and you just basically hang out with all the Hall of Famers, and you drive them where they need to go. Now, it takes about 20 years of paying paying your dues and driving a big van and just carting around whoever gets in your car or your van at the time. But then the last 10 years, I've been driving in a Shiny every year. So this year, my guy was Champ Bailey. Last year was Brian Dawkins. I've had Kurt Warner, Al Davis, John Madden. So I've had some interesting people, and it's just an amazing weekend of being right there with them. Everybody's jealous. They're always like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you got to spend a weekend." But before you get too jealous, let me tell you how exhausting it is too. So I was, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night were the 4 nights that he was in town that I drove him. The times that I went to bed those 4 nights were 2 a.m., 1 a.m., 3 a.m., and 5 a.m.
Well, I hope there's some good stories behind that, maybe.
There's always good stories. The problem is, of course, I can't drink. So I get to go to the party and I can sit in the corner, but that's about as fun as it gets. Now granted, you meet some people and you see, have some chats. I mean, I was chatting with Pat Boland's son-in-law, and just talking about fantasy football. I gave him my book. I always have him in the car, of course, during Hall of Fame weekend. And he was excited. He's from Canada. He loves playing. He was so pumped up to get the book and know that, he met, all of a sudden I was his superstar. Like this guy and his families were billions of dollars, but all of a sudden I was the cool kid on the block because I had this book. And so it's fun. You meet a lot of great people, and some are just surprises of people you think you don't even know who they really are. And all of a sudden you find out this connection, that connection. And so I've been doing it for 30 years, and that's why you saw those pictures on Twitter.
Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but who was your favorite person to drive?
To be honest with you, it just happened last year. Brian Dawkins. Oh my gosh, just an amazing human being. When you see that intensity that you saw on the field and in the videos, but yet then he's very soft-spoken, a very strong Christian. Him and who is his buddy that's in the. Oh, I just went blank. But anyway, just a great, great person, just so motivating, just so supportive. I was disappointed. He couldn't make it back this year. I didn't get to see him, but definitely one of my favorite. But, there's so many guys that I have great stories and had great times with. But Brian was just kind of, the coolest. But I'll give you a quick best story ever, though. With the first 4 or 5 years I drove, I had a big, typical, 15-passenger van. And this is 1990, and they're like, "Hey, could you help drive the ESPN guys, because there's 8 or 9 of them that all have to go to the various places to record things." So it's Chris Berman, Tom Jackson, Sterling Sharp, the producers. And really for the first 3 or 4 years, that was my job. And so I became very good friends with Chris Berman. And Chris Berman then invited me and my buddy to spend a Sunday at ESPN Studios back in 1995.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's amazing.
So we did. We flew up there. We got a hotel. We showed up Sunday morning at 9 a.m. and I videotaped the whole day. And I still say it's probably the greatest male non-sexual fantasy you could have. And I'm not sure there's too many sexual fantasies that get much better than it, because I just sat there and looked at my buddy. I'm like, you realize what we just did today? I mean, there's guys that would give up their left arm for something like this. We just got to do it just because we were in the right spot, doing the right thing, driving the right people. So that's my favorite story of all time. And Chris is still a friend. He nicknamed me Aqualung. So so I got my own Berman nickname too.
That's awesome. That is a fantastic story, and definitely something that is unique, and everybody clearly doesn't have anything,
right,
like that. That's awesome. So
thanks.
Getting into consistency itself, what caused you to take this deep dive into consistency? Let's hear the why behind it.
Well, the why, like I said, I've been playing fantasy football since 1985. So we started playing because it was before the internet. We were doing everything basically on Lotus 1, 2, 3 on a very high-powered 256 megabyte PC. I happened to just have the only, I worked in an accounting firm, so I had access to it. And so I became the commissioner. But so it was touchdown only. So rushing touchdowns, 6 points. Passing touchdowns were 3 points for the quarterback, 3 points for the wide receiver. And that was our scoring method. And kickers. That was it. So a typical game was like 24-20, 28-25. I mean, it was like real football scores. So we fast forward to 2002, and that year I draft Shaun Alexander, who ends up winning the MVP that year, rushes for 15 touchdowns. However, he rushed for 5 touchdowns in one game on a Monday night, 3 in another game, and 2 in another game. So he scored 2/3 of his touchdowns in only 3 out of the 14 regular season games. Needless to say, my team goes 7-7. I don't make the playoffs, but I'm one of the highest scoring teams in the league. And so being an accountant and a bean counter and a number cruncher, this drove me nuts. I'm like, how in the world could this happen? So I looked and I realized that, those big games, and I'm like, man. So what I did is I figured out if they would have just scored 1 touchdown every week over those 14 weeks, I would have won 2 more games, made the playoffs, won the championship. It was really that simple. And it just jumped at me like, wow, if this works for this, what about, in other scoring methods and other leagues? And could I apply this to every position and scenario? So I did. So, started doing Excel stuff and had a brother-in-law who was into Visual Basics and could do some programming. And long story short, here I am today and, has just continued to improve it, expound on it, make it into, a better tool that's easy to use. I mean, right now, you can go to the website, BigEyeFantasySports.com. You can put in your own scoring method, and it will show you who the most consistent players were in your league last year. And you can download that into Excel, use it for your draft prep. So that was one of the things I wanted to make it easy, simple to use, easy to understand. And then it got to, that point. Then I created the magazine 3 years ago because I kept writing an article every year for some of the magazines like Fantasy Football Guide, those kind of people. But I wanted to make my own profiles and put them out there for people. But there wasn't enough room in everybody else's magazines. So I found out Amazon allows you to self-publish. And basically, long story short, 3 years ago, I created my own magazine. And 3 years later, I won Best Magazine of the Year.
So 2 things. One, you mentioned Visual Basic. I took a Visual Basic class when I was in college, and I actually almost missed the final. And that is one of the moments, and it shouldn't be one of the moments that really stands out to me in college, but it is. Mm-hmm. And I remember they had a 2-hour time slot, and I got there with half an hour left because I realized that I misread the final schedule. And nice. I finally made it. But this is actually the first time I've thought about Visual Basic since then. Right. So yeah. Bob, thanks for bringing up bad memories here.
That's fine. No, that's what I'm here for, man.
But back to consistency. So we really have Shaun Alexander to thank for all this.
We do. We well, thank him or hate him. But either way, it got me to that point of thinking about it. And like I said, I just kind of like, oh, gosh, if it applies to him, of course, at that time, 95 now, fantasy football is really starting to pick up. There's more online software like Yahoo and those, and you're playing with, you're now doing, PPR scoring and more involved yards and stuff like that. So like I said, I just started figuring out how I could kind of scrape some stats off the internet, created my own calculation, figured it all out, and then just started, using that and pretty much use the same calculation I do today. And it works, and it seems to work pretty well. And like I said, it's a simple process for people to look at. You can look at a guy and go, okay, he's either 50% consistent, so half the games he's good for you, or he's 75%. There's no, some of the games he's in the top 12, some he's in the top 20. People do that with their consistency stuff, and that's nice, and it does break it down a little more, but I feel like it's just too much. Just give me a number. Is this guy 75, 50, or 100%,
And it's such an easy reference point, just like you mentioned. You literally can pick up the consistency guide. Even if you're just glancing over it, it's very clear what information is being presented. Right. And you're not having to guess, or you're not having to really, read into it too much. It's right there. It's very clear. And it's good for anybody, whether you've been in fantasy for 30 years or this is your first year. So it really is a great tool. And before we move on and before we really dive into, roster construction, something that Mitch wants to talk about, one term that you use and one metric that you have created in your consistency guide is X consistency. Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about that, how that came about, and how it's different than just typical normal consistency?
Right. So, you look at a list of players and you look at their consistency. And so let's say you see 2 guys that are, both 75% consistent over the year. You think, okay, well, which one's better? And you can say, well, at first you would say, all right, well, it's obviously the person that has the most points. But if some guy misses 3 or 4 games and doesn't have as many total points, then I said, and they're both 75%. How do you judge that? And so I do a little bit of fantasy baseball, just playing, not writing. And they have a stat called XERA, which is kind of taking that ERA number and kind of fine tuning it to say, this is involved and that's involved. And I don't know all those stats, so I won't even try to explain it. But it was kind of a way of fine tuning it. So what I looked at is said, hey, if you take, player A and, just do his average points per game times his consistency factor, so times that 75%, and you take player B average points per game, that way you can look at it and say if they both played 16 games and they're both 75% consistent, then player A is better because his X consistency is 15 points a game versus this guy who's might be only 12. So that's what the X consistency was really trying to do, is kind of fine tune the consistency factor into a more, kind of separating those people they're at the same numbers and who's better and who's not.
Now, with one of the players that we're going to talk about in a little bit, it makes a ton of sense why he might have a higher X consistency, even though he missed a few games this year. And again, I don't want to spoil it. We'll get to that eventually. But Mitch, did you want to talk about the roster construction here?
Yeah, I was just wondering, using this information and looking at the roster construction, are you building most of your rosters in a similar fashion by rounding up the more consistent guys?
Well, what I try to do is, so in the back of the consistency guide, I created a new thing last year, or a few years ago, called the tier draft list. And basically what I do is I put the players in tiers. And this is not something, that's on the edge. Everybody does tiers in fantasy football. But what I do in the upper left corner of that sheet, when you print it out, and it's an Excel file, it's a one piece of paper, your whole draft is right there, but it has this kind of, I call it a draft advisor. And what it does is it says, hey, you know what, if you're picking in the first round, you're going to want obviously a running back 1A or wide receiver 1A, and you want to get that, and then you keep building. But the whole idea of building the core when you're in my strategy is when I'm drafting is that I want my starting lineup basically in place within the first 7 to 8 rounds. I mean, I'm not do the crazy 5 running backs in the first 5 rounds. I'm not going to get 4 wide receivers in a row. I'm going to get a quarterback, a tight end, and basically, 2-3 running backs and 3 or 4 wide receivers, depending on where I'm drafting and how it falls out. But I want that core, almost all those guys, I expect them to be able to earn 70% or higher, or have earned 70% or higher. That way I know right there that I've got a consistent start to my team. Now, injuries happen and stuff happens. Then I can look outside of round 8 and start looking for maybe the guy that has a little more higher upside. Maybe he didn't have the consistency this year. Maybe he had a down year last year. Then I start looking for those guys who might be able to fill the gaps after that. But that's how I build my roster. That's my thing. And that's what I try to preach to the people who are reading the guide and ask me questions of, hey, what should I do? I tell them, use that advisor and make sure you realize that in the first 7 or 8 rounds, you want to have this starting lineup, but you want it to have a core consistency of about 70% or higher.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you use the same approach for Dynasty and Redraft?
Well, I don't play a lot of Dynasty. In fact, I'm only in one Dynasty league. Actually, no, I'm in 2 now. But my first Dynasty draft, which was obviously a full draft, I just did a couple weeks ago down in Columbus with actually a bunch of guys on Twitter that you guys probably know, a lot of experts from the Ohio area. I mean, obviously, I looked for younger players with good consistency. So, yeah. I'm drafting the Curtis Samuels and the, David Johnsons instead of Larry Fitzgerald or Deshaun Jackson. So I did look a little bit more at the age and the years of service at this point. Obviously, it makes sense, but I've done a lot of Dynasty podcasts with guys, and a lot of them said that they're using the guide to find those really good values of veterans that they can get with a high consistency rating that people will write off because, quote, they're too old. Yep. They're almost 30 or they're 29, and exactly. but yet they were 70% consistent last year. Well, why would you not put them on your team? You still have to win one year, so you can't keep playing for next year forever. So they said, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense that we could use this consistency information to identify those guys that we can get later while everybody's grabbing the shiny new toys, rookies and second-year players, to get some good, solid veterans to kind of help raise the floor of consistency in their league and be able to maybe win this year and next year and the year after. I mean, and keep going. So that's kind of what they have told me about the dynasty approach to it.
So, Bob, I have a question for you. How sticky is this year over year? So last year, I got into a little bit of writing, and one thing that I did, I wrote a series of articles about weekly consistency. And looking over the 2017 season, one of the guys that I had a big knock on was Julio Jones. And Mitch and I actually had a wager in 2018 who was going to have more, wide receiver 2 weeks. And I had Michael Thomas and he had Julio Jones, and he actually won the bet, which going into it, I was like, oh, there's no way this is going to happen. And then you look at the running backs, and it was guys in 2017 when they were healthy, like a Dalvin Cook or Leonard Fournette. And it was kind of based on running back usage. How sticky is this year to year?
Well, again, I think a lot of it, there's a few factors. Number one, are they on the same team, same system, same head coach, same offensive coordinator? So if guys don't have a tremendous amount of change and they've proven themselves consistent, then it's usually going to stick. But usually what happens is, Julio Jones is a great example. About 3 years ago, if you remember the year they actually made it to the Super Bowl, that was Julio Jones' worst year from a consistency standpoint. It was like 69%, which sounds pretty good. 70%, that's pretty good. Problem is Julio is usually in the upper 80s or higher, in the 80 or plus. What happened that year was that offensive coordinator that year had them spread the ball around. So they didn't always look for Julio as much. And it was actually Matt Ryan's most consistent year ever. And if you remember, I think he either won the MVP or was damn close to it.
Yep, I think he did win it that year.
Yeah. So, it was Matt Ryan's most consistent year and was an MVP year, but it was Julio Jones' worst. The next year, things change. And over the last couple of years, now they went back to Julio getting the ball more, getting more targets, getting more looks. And surprisingly, not surprising, Matt Ryan now is not as consistent. Now, last year, he's actually pretty good. He was 75%. And I expect it to kind of continue now because they are throwing the ball more, and as they had in the past. Dirk Cutter, certainly helps that situation. We were when Sarkisian left, we thought, okay, good, we got somebody worthwhile coming in to help kick up the offense. It wasn't bad last year. Obviously, Freeman being hurt them quite a bit, but I think that Julio will be back. But yeah, like I said, most players, if they're staying in the same place and they don't have any drastic changes, if they're consistent in the past, they'll be consistent going forward. Usually what you see is somebody goes and changes teams and they kind of take a slide down, because, they're learning a new offense, like I look at Antonio Brown this year, frozen feet or not frozen feet. I'm very worried about his consistency because, he was 80, 90, even 100% consistent in Pittsburgh. I really couldn't see him doing that. I could see him being 70%, but that's not the Julio or not the Antonio Brown we're used to. So I've stayed pretty far away from him, and now him and Elsa can just hang out together because I'm not drafting.
It took me a second to get the reference. I was like, all right, frozen. So now that we kind of have the building blocks and we kind of talked about the background of consistency and the deep dive that you really took into it, I want to hit on a few players. And they're guys that when Mitch and I were looking over this list of the X consistency ratings, it was kind of surprising. So first up, again, we have a quarterback here, Super Flexology. This is a guy that I really like him in 2019. Mitch, I think you're relatively in the same ballpark as I am. Bob, Jameis Winston. Mm-hmm. So the X consistency rating, he actually ranked quarterback 10. And it's crazy because on paper, or even just talking about Jameis Winston, you think he has his ups and his downs, and there's games he's throwing 3-4 picks. And then you think about safer options, right? You have Jared Goff, Phillip Rivers, Aaron Rodgers. According to your X consistency rating, Jameis Winston is actually above those three guys. Right. And so if you would just randomly ask, if I threw a Twitter poll on tonight and I said from week to week, even if we just said consistent, who was the most consistent quarterback last year? Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody is going to pick Jameis Winston.
Right.
So I guess my question here is, how can you use the consistency and the X consistency, in situations like this to your advantage? Like, do you ever bring this up in trade talks, or maybe that Jameis Winston is more consistent on a week-to-week basis for the weeks that he plays, and you kind of can use that to your advantage?
Absolutely, and everybody could use this to their advantage. So if you're looking into a league, or you're looking, obviously the biggest value of consistency is when you can find a player who has proven consistency, but nobody knows it except the guys, all of you out there who have bought the book. And so you see their ADP being in like round 11 and you're like, but Bob has him ranked 29th. And like my perfect example right now was, until a couple weeks ago, or actually to probably a week or so ago, and now all of a sudden he's just skyrocketing because everybody's realizing that I was right 4 months ago, but that's not the point. And the guy is Curtis Samuel. So last year, in my book, and again, this came out May 1st, it literally says, DJ Moore is going in round 6, Curtis Samuel is going in round 11, and yet Curtis Samuel had more fantasy points, a better consistency rating, a better X-consistency rating, and he's going 5 rounds later. And so I was drafting Curtis Samuel in round 10, 11, getting him as my wide receiver 5 because I have him right. I think he's going to be a top 36 player. And consistency wise, he was 27th. And so that's the kind of stuff that, I want to help people understand, when they're looking at their ADPs and they're looking at their draft list to kind of add this to their arsenal. If you want to get your big stats from Fantasy Alarm or Full-Time Fantasy or any of the top sites, I don't care. That's fine. But get the subscription to the site, get to that clutch report, put in your scoring method, download the consistency information, get the guide, and then start looking at, oh, wow, Bob's got this guy ranked here, ADP's down there. Okay, mark him as my, one of my values. But same way, like you said, in trades, and I could see dynasty trades too. If you'd have looked at the book, somebody been like, hey, Curtis Samuel, hey, he's okay. How about I'll trade you, a 2021 third round pick for him. Oh, all right. Next thing you know, you're sitting on a guy that's ready to break out and, have a great season and already proved he can be consistent from the year before. Those are the kind of things that the guide will help you do.
Right. It's funny that you brought up Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore. Just a few weeks ago during one of our episodes, we had a training camp episode, and that I don't want to say it's a battle because they're both going to see the field.
Right.
But that was something that we brought up, and it's crazy because there is a big discrepancy between their current ADPs and Curtis Samuel. I think it was the last 9 games of the season or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was more
75%. Yeah, 75% consistency. Now I do it consistency wise, but yeah, more fantasy points, I'm sure.
Well, it was more fantasy points per route run, and there were a few other metrics. And again, you think of these two guys, and you think, oh, it's not even close. But yeah, it was even just straight fantasy points. Curtis Samuel was wide receiver 20 in that stretch. I think it was 8 or 9 games, to end the season. And DJ Moore was like 28. But again, you look at ADP, and then you brought it up consistency. Obviously, Curtis Samuel is the better bargain right now.
Right.
And I think, you said you brought up in May, and I think a lot of people, they're catching up on that right now.
So I'm looking at fantasy football calculators, which I usually use, and DJ Moore's still in round 6, but Curtis Samuel's now is now in round 9 and moving up. So
he's creeping up a little bit.
Yeah. So, like I said, people are starting to take notice, and I'm glad, but, I'm also glad that I did a bunch of best ball drafts earlier this summer, and I've got him in all of them.
So we talked about, using this consistency and the X consistency to your advantage in trades. But real quick on Jameis Winston, how do you see his 2019 going? So Bruce Arians is there, the quarterback whisperer.
Right.
And yeah, they lost a few receivers, but now people are expecting O.J. Howard and Chris Godwin to step up. Do you think he can beat that quarterback 10 in terms of X consistency in 2019?
Well, I have him ranked, I think, in my sheet, I have him ranked, where I got him. Yeah, I have him 11th. So, in my rankings, I have him in the top 12, and I don't think a lot of people do, but his consistency shows that. You got to remember last year was kind of a hot mess. He had the suspension, and then, he got benched once for Ryan Fitzpatrick. But when push comes to shove, 65% consistency last year ranked him 10th. If he just matches that, if he's just around 65, 70%, which I think would be a very easy scenario for him to do in this offense, he's still probably going to be top 12. You got to remember the other reason for all of this is that Tampa Bay's defense is by far the worst in the NFL.
Oh, it's bad.
they are going to give up points like a sieve. And then you're playing the Falcons twice, you're playing the Saints twice, the Panthers twice. I don't even know the rest of their schedule. I don't need to at that point. So he's going to be chucking the ball all over the place. And yeah, he's going to have his games where he's probably going to throw 2 or 3 interceptions in 1 or 2. He might have one with 4, but he'll probably also throw 4 or 5 touchdowns just to keep him in the game. He's going to put up a lot of garbage yards. That's why I still like him. Now, the funny thing is, like you said, from an ADP standpoint, I'm not drafting him as my starter in any league. He's my backup. And so if I have him as my backup, let's say he catches fire the first 3 or 4 weeks, now I have a trade bargain, a trade chip. I might throw him out there and say, hey, I need, maybe I lose maybe I had Ezekiel Elliott in a lot of leagues, which I do. And so, maybe now I need a solid running back because obviously I'm hurt because Zeke's not going to play for a few games because he's holding out. Whatever the case may be, that's the kind of stuff, you can use to your advantage as well, like you said, with the trade scenarios.
Absolutely. And Mitch, you and I, we've hit on Jameis Winston, I think multiple episodes throughout the Superflexology series so far. Has your mind changed at all, or have your beliefs just kind of been reaffirmed as the offseason's progressed?
Just reaffirmed. According to Warren Sharp, who's the creator of Sharp Football Stats, it's a site that we use all the time.
Smart guy.
The Bucs have the easiest passing schedule in the league. And when Arians was with the Cards in 2015, they were first in the league in yards and second in points. 2016, they were 9th in the league in yards and 6th in points. And I think it's just something that's going to happen again this year.
And that was with Carson Palmer, who was okay.
Exactly. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, definitely give me the skill pieces with the Bucs now than what, the Cards had 3 years ago.
Well, I'm going to throw a word out here, so at least you're being consistent with your evaluation here of Jameis Winston. And Bob, I have to throw in at least one corny joke every episode.
No, that's fine.
So I just hit our quota for the night.
One? You got to do more than that.
I was going to say
I'll throw some in if I have to.
You did the Elsa. Exactly.
I did the Elsa joke.
So a running back that I want to hit on, and in the show notes, I just put next to this guy, this one blew my mind. So, Mitch, I want your opinion here before we, get to Bob and the consistency aspect. James White, so he finished running back 9 in terms of X consistency rating. Do you see him being as productive this year as he was last year? Or do you think with the, it was kind of a perfect storm last year, in my opinion. There were so many injuries and so many games where he stepped in to fill a certain role because a player was out. So, Mitch, how do you see it playing out in 2019? Do you think he's going to be even nearly as productive as he was last year?
He's going right around RB26 right now, and I think that's probably fair. But my big worry about him is he averaged the 3 seasons prior to last year, he averaged about 70 targets a season. And last year he had 123. And like you said, that was with Edelman being out and all the injuries they had on that offense. It's training camp news, so you don't really know what to believe. But we hear Sony Michel getting split out as well. So maybe James White isn't the only running back that they're using in that role now. So I worry that if his targets go down, I don't think he's going to be able to come close to replicating what he did last year.
And then, Bob, from a consistency standpoint, how do you see it shaping up this year? And again, when I looked at this and I saw running back 9 for X consistency, that was the guy. He jumped off the page.
Right. Well, and basically, like as he said. It was the perfect storm. All of those injuries, everything basically fell into place. The first 9 games of the year, he was perfectly consistent. He went 9 for 9 in clutch games, which is over about 11.5 points in a PPR scoring format. The last 7 games of the year, he went 3 for 7. What happened? Well, everybody got healthy. Julian was back. Sony Michel was healthy. I mean, look at the playoffs. Look at the Super Bowl. James White was pretty much non-existent because Sony Michel was running like a wildfire. If that all happens this year, that's exactly what I expect it to be. I'm even a little worried that James White, even at RB26, is a little high because if you look at the 2 years prior to that, his consistency was about between 35 and 45%. He'd have those games where they were playing a high-powered offense. You knew they were going to have to throw the ball a lot, and he would get more involved. But if they're playing against a team with an average offense that's really not going to really make the Patriots have to play catch up or keep up, and when you realize they're playing the Bills twice, the Jets twice, the Dolphins twice, I just don't see James White getting a lot of usage. And I think Mitch's scenario of the targets he normally would get and the consistency that he's shown, I just can't see James White being productive again.
And, you talked about the 35 to 40% consistency rate in previous seasons. And Mitch, you brought up the difference in targets. A few weeks ago, on a show, we talked about regression to the mean. Mm-hmm. And that's no different than this situation. Well, I mean, every situation in football, basically, but especially this one. If he's gone with this amount of targets 3 years prior to last year, and then he jumps up 40 or 50 targets, and his consistency was 35, 40% for a few years, and jumps up to running back 9 last year, we have to believe if that offense stays healthy, James White is going to be one that's going to struggle.
Absolutely.
Now, there are 2 wide receivers. And again, it's crazy because you talk about guys and boom bust is always the lingo that people want to throw, the phrase that people want to throw out for, especially a wide receiver, that they're going to have a great week followed by a dud. And I'm just going to throw these 2 wide receivers together, Tyreek Hill and T.Y. Hilton. Hill was wide receiver 8 in terms of X consistency in 2018. Mm-hmm. T.Y. Hilton was wide receiver 14. Again, if you talk to a person, or we threw a poll up on Twitter right now, neither of those guys is going to win a consistency battle against another wide receiver. I guess my question for these 2, Bob, how did they earn that ranking? I know it's based, you told us the formula, is very clear, but again, you think about these guys and man, boom, bust, it follows them.
Well, it may have. In fact, a couple of years ago, especially the year that T.Y. didn't have Andrew Luck at quarterback, T.Y. had like 33% consistency that year. He's definitely a product of Andrew Luck. Is he a good wide receiver? Yeah, he is. But they really didn't have a good wide receiver too last year. I mean, they were bringing in guys like Chester Rogers, and I don't remember who the other guy was, but Chester Rogers is the one that comes to mind. So he obviously got a ton of targets. If they weren't throwing to T.Y., they were throwing to Eric Ebron. But T.Y. got a ton of targets last year. I can see him dropping down a little bit this year. They got Paris Campbell, Devin Funchess, Jack Doyle's back. They got a much better, now Marlon Mack starting to come into his own running game wise. Great offensive line. But now we have Luck hurt again. So I'm a little worried about T.Y. this year. Tyreek Hill, I mean, I think a lot of people are surprised that his consistency last year was only 75%. I think a lot of people thought it was higher than that because his total points, he was 3rd overall. So he definitely I think he had more of a boom and not so big a boom. Right. Like, cherry bomb and firecracker. Because his big games were huge and the rest of the games were pretty good. He didn't have really any duds that he'd had in the past. So, this year I expect him to be right around there. I know a lot of people are moving him into the early 2nd round, end of the 1st round. It's like, hold up a little bit, guys. 75% consistency. And actually, the funny thing is him and Michael Thomas are both going late 1st, early 2nd. And they were both 75% consistent last year, which is respectable, but also ranks 14th and 15th for wide receivers. That's not end of 1st, early 2nd, guys. That's not where you want to draft that guy. The problem is that's where they're going. So for those of you out there really liking Tyreek and Michael Thomas, be a little cautious. You can get other guys in that same area like Julio Jones, Odell Beckham Jr., those kind of folks that have proven 80% or more consistency. You may want to, hold off and maybe look at a different angle at that point.
And you brought up Tyreek Hill's ADP, whether it's redraft or dynasty, the roller coaster ride that is his ADP this offseason.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Holy cow. And of course, off the field issues, that was the concern and that was the issue. It wasn't on the field. And from an on the field perspective, Mitch, I know you're a fan of Tyreek Hill, but a guy that we don't really talk about, I don't think we've really brought him up on the show to date, is T.Y. Hilton. And I don't really know your thoughts on him, Mitch. So how do you see him, I guess, from a 2019 standpoint and also a dynasty standpoint? Is T.Y. Hilton somebody you're investing in?
Yeah, I definitely buy him. The problem is he's usually, when we're drafting, he's going right around running backs that I like more. So I usually end up with those running backs instead of him. But for what his price is, he only played in 14 games last year, and 9 of those games he had over 75 yards. And he also had 8 or more targets in 9 of those games. Right. So that's easy to see why he's ranked so high. And then Hill's funny, just like you were saying about the different little explosions that he has. He only had 1 game under 50 yards if you take out the game where he got hurt against the Raiders. But then he had 5 games with 2 or more touchdowns.
Wow.
And so he just took off.
Yeah.
And, I like them both pretty much where they're being drafted. In the summer, like John was bringing up, I was drafting him, and everyone else was saying stay away. So I think he's a guy that if you did take him, in best ball leagues during the summer, that's a guy who could easily win you your league this year.
Oh, especially at that deflated ADP when all the off the field issues were going on. Definitely an advantage in best ball, like you said, Mitch. But even dynasty or redraft, that's a huge advantage if you were able to get him at that price. To wrap things up here, there's one tight end I want to talk about. And Bob, all the time on the show, we talk about Twitter darlings, and this is one of them. This has to be one of the favorite tight end prospects and targets that people are looking at. And his consistency was tight end 25, and that's Mark Andrews. So one thing I want to talk about with Mark Andrews, and maybe you can talk about this from the consistency standpoint. Does it take into account, so obviously there was the change midseason, Joe Flacco to Lamar Jackson. Are you incorporating any of that, or is this just cold hard, these are the numbers, this is the rating?
Well, So so some of the things I'll look at is their splits. So in the consistency profiles, in the consistency guide, you'll see that there is a kind of a one-liner that says clutch games by week. And basically what that's showing is when are they earning those clutch games? So if I see a guy that maybe puts up 3 out of 4 at the end of the year, then I'm looking at that guy as a potential breakout for more consistent the year after. So when I look at Mark Andrews, I noticed that, he only earned 4 overall, but he did earn 3 of those 4 out of the last 6 games. So that's only 50%. You say, well, that's not very good. But the problem is 56% was a top 12 tight end. So, and he did do 2 straight at the end of the year with Lamar Jackson in check. So, there is a little love, I give him a little more love than, and maybe not as much love as the Twitter darlings. I'm not giving him that much love. I'll be honest with you. I don't have him on any team that I own. It's not something that I even think about because I'm usually either getting Ingram in the 5th or 6th round, or I'm waiting and getting like a Jack Doyle / Delaney Walker in rounds 10 or 11 instead. But, there's certainly possibility. Lamar Jackson definitely doesn't have the best arm out there by any stretch, but he makes things happen. He moves around, short passes, tight end type scenario. That's certainly got a lot of potential there. As a late round flyer, I certainly understand the Mark Andrews love.
Now, is there any concern? So you look at you mentioned 3 out of 6 games that he had the high clutch rating,
game, right?
The clutch game. Is there a concern though in games like that where maybe he was just extremely efficient with the targets he had? So are you taking stuff like that into account for maybe 2019 projections?
I mean, I don't look that deep into it, because there's so many. I mean, if I dive really deep into all this, I'm sure I could sit there and probably have 4 arguments one way for a player and 4 arguments the other way for a player, just because there's so many different stats. And a lot of people like to do that. They're like, okay, so, but remember that this happened and that. And I'm like, yeah, but the way I look at it is if they're consistent, they're consistent. I don't go, well, he scored 12 touchdowns last year, and the year before he only scored 8, so he's more touchdown dependent. So how do you know that's going to come into play? Well, I don't, but they could still be 75% consistent, have 8 touchdowns this year and just catch 20 more balls or get, 100 more yards, or, there's all combinations. And the key is that they're over that factor every week to be worthy of being a starter on your fantasy team. And that's what it's all about. So, I don't get too deep into the stuff. I get, and that's why I let people, that's their specialty of what they're looking at, whether it's yards after catch or yards per target or whatever the case may be. Let them break them down their way, and people can gather that knowledge and just add it all together.
And that's come up with so many players in terms of efficiency. And that's one thing that people knock certain players for. We talk about Tyler Lockett. You look at Alvin Kamara. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's no way these guys can be this efficient. And then like Kamara, he's done it 2 years in a row, and he's probably going to do it a third year.
Yeah, right.
So I get what you're saying from a consistency standpoint. It doesn't really matter how it happens, just that it does.
Right. A lot of people were very shocked that I have Julian Edelman ranked 6th on my list, ahead of Michael Thomas. And I don't know if I got him ahead of AB. Maybe I think I do. And they're like, I can't believe you haven't ranked that high. It's ridiculous. His ADP is blah, blah, blah. I'm like, he was 92% consistent last year in the 11 games he played, or 12 games he played because he missed those 4 because of suspension. I said, look at the Super Bowl. Look at his consistency during the year. This guy's a PPR machine. How you cannot draft him as your least wide receiver 2? I mean, I could justify he could be a 1, but more often than not, you can get him at least as a 2, sometimes as a wide receiver 3, depending on where you're drafting and where he's falling. So those are the kind of things that I try to kind of again showing the value and consistency and where you can draft these guys. And if you can get a guy who's 92% consistent in round 4, and oh, by the way, the next ADP up is Robert Woods, who was 88% consistent last year. But yet, if you hear people talk about the Rams wide receivers, they'll put Brandon Cooks first, Cooper Kupp second, and Robert Woods third. That's fine. You guys do that. I'll take my 88% consistency and just roll with it.
Yeah, I always say Robert Woods is the most underrated wide receiver in the league because you bring him up and no one will talk about him. They'll bring up like Brandon Cooks or someone else, right. But it's always, I love Robert Woods.
Yeah, no, I have him in a lot of leagues.
And Bob, I'm glad that you brought up Julian Edelman. It makes me feel better. So Mitch and we co-own a few teams together, and he really didn't give me a choice. He made us draft Julian Edelman in a few places. So the fact that he had that high consistency rating, I'm starting to come down off the ledge a little bit. I feel more comfortable. So thank you for that.
You should.
You made up for yourself after bringing up Visual Basic earlier in the show.
All right, thanks.
And with Mark Andrews, Mitch, a few weeks ago, in one of our league chats, you said, am I the only one that's not getting this Mark Andrews hype? How do you feel today? Are you still in that same boat?
I still don't get it, to be honest.
I don't get it. Yeah.
There's no one in the top 12 in ADP right now that I would take Mark Andrews over besides Eric Ebron. That's because I don't think he should be in the top 12 to begin with. Mark Andrews didn't have a game with more than 5 catches, and he only had 5 games total with 50 yards. I mean, that's great for a tight end 12, but it's not hard to find a tight end 12.
When you look at the ADP where he's at, so he's going in the 13th round, and you got guys like Greg Olsen, Jack Doyle, Jordan Reed around him. I mean, I would take all 3 of those guys every day of the week because they've all proven themselves that they can be consistent. Jack Doyle was 67% consistent last year until he got hurt. I mean, he was a PPR target for Andrew Luck last year. Ebron was the touchdown guy, but Jack Doyle was the PPR guy. We know that Jordan Reed, when he's healthy, can be very consistent in any offense, and especially when you have a terrible quarterback like Casey Keenum involved. And Greg Olsen, he's loved by, Cam Newton. His foot is 100% healthy this year. I still keep hoping that he'll, just magically decide about a week before the season starts to retire and go to the booth so Ian Thomas can take over.
Love Ian Thomas.
Ian Thomas. Yeah. He was, he put up 4 straight clutch games last year at the end of the year. I so was hoping Olsen was not going to come back. But anyway, all those guys are proven commodities in consistency. Mark Andrews hasn't proved anything to me yet. I just can't take him, even as a backup tight end.
Completely agree.
So we're all on board there with Mark Andrews. I think a lot of people we're going to get a lot of negative feedback. So I'm going to make sure I check.
Bring it.
Make sure I check our podcast reviews after this releases. Yeah. But consistency, it's so important, and it's something that a lot of people don't talk about. When you're valuing players and when you're talking in whether it's a trade negotiation or a league group chat or on Twitter, consistency is not really brought up. And the one thing, whenever, like I said, I wrote a few articles last year. Again, I think I'm very clever and I have these puns, but the series was called Deception is Reality. And you look at these end of season numbers and it tells you one thing, but when you break it down and you look, okay, he really only was successful and had strong weeks 50% of the time. Mm-hmm. You brought up Sean Alexander from 2002, and that's a prime example where end of season numbers, fantastic. But what is it really doing for you? You said you were 7-7. So I think it's such a great way to look at things. And again, it's something that not a lot of people are talking about. And the fact that you did such a deep dive in your book, I mean, it's like 180 pages or something. I mean,
160, but yeah, it's close. But
it's just such great analysis and things that people aren't talking about. And, beyond well-deserving of the FSWA, 2018 best publication. So congratulations to that.
Thank you.
A little late on the congratulations, but still congratulations nonetheless.
I'll take it anytime. I'll take the love. No, but like you said, what people have to get over is what this is so important is when they look at just a traditional, hey, this was your top 12 quarterbacks last year in total points, and you see Jared Goff 6th and you see Drew Brees 8th, and you go, man, I've got to get one of those guys as my starter on my fantasy team. And then you look at their consistency numbers in the guide and you go, wow, Jared Goff was only 56% and Drew Brees was 47%, which ranked 21st amongst quarterbacks. You got to start thinking about that kind of stuff, folks. I know you think I'm just preaching it because I write it and I put it out there, but it is so important. And I see Drew Brees still going in those, mid rounds 5, 6, 7 with, the Aaron Rodgers and the Andrew Lucks and the Baker Mayfields. And I just sit there and I go, yep, you haven't seen the book, have you?
So I know that we talked about Jameis Winston. So before we wrap up, we talked about Jameis Winston being quarterback 10 in terms of X consistency.
Right.
Just from pure consistency, did he also rank above guys like Jared Goff and Drew Brees?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So he was 10th at 64%. Jared Goff was 56. Brees was 47. Tom Brady was 56. Phillip Rivers was 56. Kirk Cousins was 54 or 44. He was ahead of a lot of people. Now, he was ahead of Aaron Rodgers, too. But Aaron Rodgers had a really down year. He just wasn't healthy. He was actually 56%, which is his worst full season since he's been a pro. It just was a bad year for him. The offense around him just fell apart. And, so I expect him to get back. I haven't really drafted Aaron Rodgers this year. I've kind of stayed away from him. Not that I expect him to be 56% consistent again, but I just feel like Devontae Adams is still all they got. I mean, their second wide receiver is kind of questionable. Jimmy Graham's kind of questionable. The run game, Aaron Jones appears to be a very good player, but they don't use him right. And Matt LaFleur, I just don't know what to expect out of that offense. So I'm kind of staying away from him. If I'm in round 5 and it's a choice between him and Luck and Baker Mayfield and Carson Wentz, I'm probably taking all 3 of them instead of Aaron.
Okay. And I asked about Jameis Winston. I'm going to perform a little social experiment here on Twitter. I'm going to throw out the question, who was the most consistent on a week-to-week basis in 2018?
Right. Jameis
Winston, Phillip Rivers. And I'll throw Kirk Cousins in there because I think we see him as a consistent guy. Right. But I don't see how Jameis Winston wins that poll from public perception.
Probably not. Yeah, if you put the big names up, you'd definitely not win. But if you would put, if you'd put Jameis Winston, Jared Goff, Phillip Rivers, and Kirk Cousins, you probably won't see. Winston may be in the middle there, but the only people that will vote for Winston would be people that have my book.
Yeah. All right, then I'm going to throw those 4 options up.
All right. Love
Bob,
to see it.
Bob, I want you to give me the over/under. What percentage do you think votes for Winston?
I'm going to say, let's put it at 20%.
All right, perfect. So by the time this episode airs, the poll will be finished by then, but it's going to be very interesting to see. Bob, thank you so much for joining us. This was
my pleasure.
Not just informational,
awesome.
But the way that you lay it all out, it's very easy to understand, and you don't have to be a math whiz to get it.
That was
and again, you can be brand new to fantasy football, or you could have been playing for 30 years, like we said earlier. But just for all of our listeners, and this might just be, an ongoing project for you every year, obviously, but what upcoming projects do you have, and where can everybody find you on social media? And let our listeners know.
So social media, you can find me at Twitter at Bob_Lung. I do not have an Instagram, but people were telling me I should get one. I didn't realize this was going to be a fantasy. I thought Instagram was just pictures, and now they're like, you should be on Instagram because fantasy football people are out there. Like, okay, well, we'll see.
We just made the transition over there, and it's interesting. I still enjoy Twitter a lot more.
Yeah, I think Twitter's still the best scenario just because of the interacting and the chatting. But anyway, so that's where you can find me. There is a Facebook page for Big Guy Fantasy Sports. That, of course, is the website you can go to. So I tell people, if you want to, this is something you're just hearing about, you want to get involved, you want to add this to your arsenal, go to Amazon, get the book. If you have Prime, you can get it in 2 days. When you get the book, at the bottom of the pages, you'll see a VIP upgrade code. Use that code, go to Big Guy Fantasy Sports, and get the VIP access. So that gets you the access to that clutch report where you can put in your own scoring method, get all of the information you need for your drafts. But it also includes the whole season, all of the articles. And we update the stats every week so that you can actually follow the consistency of the players all during 2019. You can find great waiver wire pickups, all that kind of stuff. I always write about that in the articles, and so you get that for the whole year for $10. So it's a great deal. So that's it. The one thing I am working on that I'm trying to put together, and I got somebody building for me, is using consistency for this new prop bet world of looking at prop bets and not looking at the prop bet for Tom Brady this week is 285 yards. Well, Tom Brady over the last 3 games has averaged 316. Well, so you should take the over. Well, but what if one of the games was 400 yards and the other 2 were 250?
Yep.
All of a sudden, that doesn't make sense. So I'm kind of trying to apply that. I have all this data of game scenarios of how consistent they are at home and away and against top 10 defense, bottom 10 defense, and all that's in the guide as well. The breakdowns between the games for the players. So going to use that information and try to kind of work on building a prop bet consistency tool that people can use and play if you can play that in your state at this point. So that's kind of the new project I'm working on. Hopefully we'll be out by the beginning of the year.
Now, when you finalize that, let me know, because I'm sure everybody knows by now I like a good wager.
All right.
I'm gonna want to see that.
All right. I'll let you be a beta tester once we get it kind of rolling and see what you think and whether you think it makes sense and how it works. So
absolutely. I'll let you know how my bank account looks afterwards.
That's awesome.
So again, Bob, thank you so much. Anybody listening to the show, go follow Bob on social media. Whenever he's on Instagram, which I think is going to happen any minute now, he said, follow him on Instagram. Go pick up your consistency guide. And as always, thank you so much for joining us and listening to the show. I'm John Bauer. You can find me on Twitter at The Bauer Club. For Mitch Sorensen at DinoMC. As always, follow the show. Find us on Twitter at Superflexology and Instagram at Superflexology. Have a great night.
Thank you for listening to the Superflexology podcast. If you want the latest news in fantasy football, follow us on Twitter at Superflexology, The Bauer Club, and DinoMC.